Good afternoon, and thank you for attending this CumbriaMed Research Webinar today. I'm Jonathan Weber. I'm co-director of the Pears Cumbria School of Medicine Research Hub, together with Professor Sophie Day. And these webinars, which we hold every month, are a way of promoting the research that we undertake at the new medical school and represent PCSM, Pears Cumbria School of Medicine, which is a collaboration between Imperial College London with the University of Cumbria and with the NHS trusts in Cumbria, North Cumbria Integrated Care, and University Hospitals Morecambe, and other NHS trusts and organisations. So we aim through these webinars to bring topical areas of research for discussion and bring them also with relevance to Cumbria. So in this particular webinar, we're going to be looking at exploring population health, both at a national level through the extraordinary results of the UK Biobank, and then locally by looking at public health in Cumbria through one of our directors of public health and from the Westmoreland Furness Council. So Dr. Chris Chiswell is a public health consultant at University Hospitals Morecambe Bay, and he works with local authorities, particularly Westmoreland and Furness, with local health services and with community partners to improve population health and reduce health inequalities across Cumbria. And so, Chris, I introduce you, and I'll leave you to introduce your colleague, Catherine Beckett, in due course.
Lovely. Thank you, Jonathan, for your welcome. And just to confirm, as I can see Catherine on my screen, if you can give me a thumbs up that those slides are visible for us, Catherine. That's great. Thank you. So very grateful, as I say, to be joined by Catherine Beckett this afternoon, who's one of the senior public health team in Westmoreland and Furness Council, who'll be taking us through the middle part of the presentation with a deeper dive into population health, particularly around ageing well in Cumbria. And thank you all to all of you for giving your time today to thinking a little bit about inequalities and population health. So we plan to use the next 15 minutes or so to help each of you really to take a step back and think about how we make sure that the sum of our innovation and our discovery efforts adds up to a healthier and more equitable experience of the health and well-being for local people in Cumbria. Without this, whilst we may undertake what in isolation will feel like very significant research and improvement, we offer it into communities who, whilst on the surface are all in the same county, face very different challenges and experiences. There may be one ocean, but local people find themselves in very different boats. And then from there, with Catherine's help, we will dive into some of the local snapshots of data across Cumbria, showing how where need is and how it is changing. And then we'll come into land by quickly summarising the who's and the where's of what's going on in public health at the moment, and highlighting where we think there are some interesting opportunities for work and collaboration. And so let's start. And let's start with thinking actually about a beautiful railway journey. It's possible, and I accept once they've finally finished the Branstey Tunnel works, of course, to board a train in Carlisle and over a couple of hours travel from the fine architecture of Carlisle along the rugged border of the West Cumbrian coast to end up at the seal colonies on Walthney Island. And while Scotland might have its Route 500, this for me is one of the undiscovered great journeys of Britain, actually, for many. But there is something else to think about as you make that journey. And that is that as you look out the window from your train, you'll see the life expectancy of the people that you pass rise and fall by several years. And in fact, if you allow yourself to walk just a little way from the station, that gap becomes more than 10 years. And if you were to zoom in either further to look at some of the communities close to the railway, you would see actually places where people die more than 20 years before they're by the biologically plausible limit that some of their close neighbours demonstrate is possible. And so despite the very rich natural resources that we enjoy in Cumbria and what you might expect to be a really salutogenic environment, lives are cut short every day right across the region in very unequal ways. And why is that? Well, to start us thinking about this, I want you to put into your mind these two bridges. Now, I have been determined to keep this as local as possible, but it has so far defied me to find a suspension bridge connected to Cumbria. I have our medical students on the hunt for one, but it's sort of eluded me so far. So indulge me, if you will, with the picture on the left that looks slightly over the border into Northumberland, and obviously on the right on the Carlisle to Settle Railway with the Ribbles Head Viaduct. When we come to think about what makes a healthy life, many of us grow up and learn to think of a model that looks something like the Union Chain Bridge on the left. In the middle is me. In the middle is this pillar of decisions and responsibilities that I make. And my path to a healthy life is suspended on all of those decisions that I choose. If I make good choices, I have a healthy life. If I don't, well, that's my fault. However, the research tells us actually a very different story about what it is to have good health and well-being. That our health journey is actually built much more like the Ribbles Head Viaduct on a wide set of pillars of basic building blocks, some of which are within our control, but many of which are not. That includes our access to good employment, our social networks, our housing, and the opportunities we're afforded by others. And if any of those are missing, it is harder for our life to follow a healthy course. It isn't just about us. And so, the dirty little secret about our efforts to improve healthcare is that only about 20 or 30% of our health outcomes, it's debated depending on which study, but somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% of our health outcomes are determined by healthcare factors, with the physical environment, wider health behaviours, and socioeconomic factors all carrying a weighty role in our total outcomes. And so if we are interested in the best possible clinical outcomes, we must be deeply invested in all of the pillars on this bridge, not just the medical ones. And this quote captures it really nicely for me, that excellent clinical care is both essential and absolutely not enough for the complex issues that we face. Now, we're looking at a bit of national data now. The reality of this was starkly drawn out a couple of decades ago by the pivotal work of Michael Marmot. And whilst initially complex, once understood, this figure for me that he brought together tells us much about the challenges that we face in the health system today, and indeed how we may well have anticipated many of them a couple of decades ago. What this work does is that he took the country and divided it up into thousands of small neighbourhoods, here represented by the individual dots, in the light green showing the life expectancy for that neighbourhood, and in the dark green showing the disability-free life expectancy of that neighbourhood. The clever part of this is that they are then sorted along the x-axis, so along the bottom of your screen, by the deprivation level of that local area. So those on the left of the screen are people who live in more deprived communities, and those are on the right, those who relatively have more advantage. And what this figure demonstrated very starkly is that there is this social gradient that runs across society. And when we look at life expectancy, so the paler green dots towards the top of the screen, what we see is that 10-year gap in life expectancy played out large right across the country. We see that that is right across the life course, but particularly important at the extremes, and particularly those in the bottom 10 to 20% of areas nationally who face adversity experience much worse health outcomes. The second part of this story is then the dark green dots that you see below that, which shows the disability-free life expectancy. Here, we see exactly the same pattern, that there is a social gradient. But what we notice is that the sort of the steepness of that, the gradient that we see, is much more profound, and therefore actually up to a 20-year gap in the disability-free life expectancy. And then the final part of the story that this one figure can tell us is the dark green band that runs across the middle. And what that shows is the UK pension age as was, and as it is forecast and planned to increase at the moment. And what you will notice is the number of those dark green dots that sit within that band, telling us that if we're not able to improve the health of these communities, if we're not able to level up, then actually the number of people below that line, the number of people who will begin to experience very significant ill health even before they reach retirement age, and the impact that that has not just on health, but also on the wealth and prosperity of our nation as well. And we see this pattern wherever we look. We see it in our outpatient data, we see it in some of our patient outcomes, we see it in community outcomes, that the net effect of these missing building blocks is scattered right across society. Taking us the other way. And we see that, obviously, as I say, not just in the macro outcomes, but also for specific disease burden. This, for me, is from a great paper published in 2023 looking at general practice data. And what it shows us is essentially the percentage of the population on the left-hand side here. So the percentage of the population that have multimorbidity, so more than 2 conditions recorded in their GP record. And what we see is that whilst at the extremes of life, age is the most powerful determinant of multimorbidity. If you're able to survive into your 80s or 90s from a deprived community, actually your multimorbidity is largely driven by your age. But actually in our middle ages and our middle to later years, actually the experience of the rich and poor is starkly different. And that gap sets an ambition for us about what is biologically possible if we can reduce inequality. It shows us the opportunity and the gap between those two things. And then finally, before I hand over to Catherine to take us into some more of the detail, particularly around healthier aging, and I know we'll touch on this in a bit more detail on the left-hand side in her talk, this is just to bring out 2 of the Chief Medical Officer's recent annual reports from 2021 and 2023 that tell us, again, some really important factors that are relevant for how we might think about healthcare in Cumbria. The left-hand one shows the change in the proportion of the population aged 75 years or older between 2021 and 2043. And the stark message for that is that coastal and rural regions are aging quicker than some of the urban centres. And that brings challenges not just in terms of healthcare, but the availability of workforce in those areas. And on the right-hand side, we see the estimates of what was coined the coastal effect within the Chief Medical Officer's report, showing that for communities that live on coast, actually there is a disproportionate amount of pretty much all of the significant disease areas that we might care to consider. And so as we get to think and zoom into Cumbria a little bit, hold those 2 bridges in mind and challenge for yourself what you think contributes to our health outcomes. Actually, that there are many of these factors beyond our control that are part of the fabric that we must respond to if we want to see this improvement in clinical outcomes. But I'm delighted now to hand over to Catherine to take us through the next part of the presentation in terms of our local data.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me okay? I'm having a couple of technical problems this afternoon with our signal, but hopefully everything will be fine. And Chris has kindly agreed to pick up if I do drop off with our terrible signal here. Thank you, Chris, for asking me to join you today. I'm delighted to join you and share with you some of the work that I'm doing on ageing well in Westmoreland and Furness. Now, I work for Westmoreland and Furness Council. You can see from the logo here. Oh, looks like we're going backwards and forwards there. So many of you may know that we've recently been through local government reorganisation in Cumbria, and as I work for Westmoreland and Furness, that's the organisation that I'm representing. But I'm also aware that this is for the Cumbria school, the Pears Medical School, and so I'm going to make sure that what I talk about is on a much broader Cumbria geographical focus. Some of you will also know that Cumbria is already one of the oldest populations in England, and I'm going to be talking to you about one of my areas within my portfolio, which is older adults and ageing well. And the reality of Cumbria having an older population is already shaping the communities and services that we have here. So I'd like you to be thinking about that and what it means for the people who live here and how we create the conditions to help them feel valued, to feel independent and to feel connected as they get older. Just in terms of setting the scene, thank you for this slide here. Let's look back to the Chief Medical Officer's report from 2023, which focused on health in an ageing society. He said that some areas are going to see a big increase in older populations and a reduction in the working age population. And although some areas might be beautiful and welcoming, some of them lack the healthcare and infrastructure needed to support older adults. He also made one essential point, and that's that poor health in later life is not inevitable. Professor Whitty highlighted 2 priorities in his report. Firstly, that we need to prevent or delay illness. And secondly, that we need to adapt our environments so that people can stay independent for longer. Now, for Cumbria, these messages really matter. Living in a largely rural or coastal area shapes how people age. Things like housing and transport, access to digital connections and that wider environment. These are factors that can support people's independence just as much as any clinical intervention, and they sometimes limit it too. So from a public health perspective, ageing well is about creating the conditions that help people to stay independent, to stay connected, to thrive, rather than treating older age as something that needs to be medicalised. Now, this next slide that you can see is the age profile. We've got Westmoreland and Furness on the left and the Cumberland area on the right, and you can see that they're very similar as a whole Cumbria. You can also see that representation of a much older age profile compared to the England line, which is the thin outline that you can see around the outside there. So we have a higher proportion of people in those older age bands where we see more frailty, care needs, and multimorbidity becomes more common. Now, this demographic isn't evenly spread across the geography. It's concentrated in certain areas, exactly as the Chief Medical Officer's report highlighted. And the effects of this are already very visible. We already know we have workforce pressures, there's an increased demand for health and care services, and there's a need for more age-appropriate housing and transport. This here is the population of our future patients and our communities. There's going to be an increasing focus on older adults living in both urban and widely dispersed rural and coastal settings, and they'll experience a really unique mix of environmental and social challenges. So moving on to life expectancy. Life expectancy tells us how long people will live, but it doesn't tell us how well they will live. We all age identically from a chronological point of view, and we all eventually die, but biologically we don't all age the same, and averages hide the real story. In some Cumbrian communities, people experience long, healthy lives, but in others, long-term illness and multimorbidity appear much earlier. And with this slide, you can see the gap very clearly. Men in the most deprived areas spend about 8.5 additional years in poorer health compared with those in the least deprived areas. And for women, that gap's even larger. It's almost 11 years between the most and the least deprived areas. And this inequality directly affects people's independence. We can see earlier frailty, earlier mobility problems, and earlier decline. And importantly, these differences are shaped by the conditions that people live in over time, things like housing, income, workload, social connections, not just their individual health behaviours, as Chris mentioned earlier. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So looking forward to 2045, these projections here is going to rise quite sharply over the next 20 years. And at the same time, we're also expecting to see a decline in the working age population in Cumbria. This is going to affect every part of the system: health and care services, housing demand, community support, and the sustainability of informal care, particularly for those rural areas. And it also reinforces why prevention, planning, and environmental design matter right now. Next slide, please, Chris. So as people age, multimorbidity, that's people living with multiple long-term conditions, becomes increasingly common. Frailty also becomes more common as people get older, meaning that they have less resilience to even small stresses. So, for example, a minor fall or an infection or a change in medication can significantly affect someone's independence. And we know that frailty develops earlier in the more deprived areas, which again reinforces why prevention is so important for delaying that decline. Next slide, please, Chris. Okay, let's look forward again to 2045. This time I'm showing you some projections for some specific conditions: dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and limiting long-term illness. They're all expected to rise quite significantly. And these are some of the conditions that can shape people's independence, their care needs, and the demand on services. This data reinforces again why we need to be acting now, both by strengthening prevention and by ensuring that the communities that we live in and the services that we have are able to support people with increasingly complex needs. And this is going to need coordinated action across multiple work streams. That's including growing our working age population and expanding the local health and care workforce. This slide here shows the projected increase in the conditions that most strongly affect day-to-day independence. And you'll see that the number of older adults experiencing falls is expected to increase from around 34,500 to over 45,000 in the next 2 decades. Again, this is why prevention approaches could make a big difference. So, for example, through strength and balance activities, creating safe and warm homes for people, ensuring they've got accessible environments, early detection and good community support are all going to be really important. Now this slide is a classic. Anyone who has ever worked in public health will be familiar with this. This is the Dahlgren and Whitehead rainbow model. It's our bread and butter in public health, and it's just as relevant today as what it was when it was developed back in 1991. The frameworks, Chris, if you could go back slightly for me to the rainbow model, thank you. What this framework does is it explains how health is influenced by things like social networks, living conditions, housing quality, income and work, transport and digital access, and that wider environment. And here in Cumbria, there are other factors, things like rural isolation, urban and coastal deprivation and digital exclusion that will also interact to influence how people age. And this layered model helps us explain why we can see patterns of early illness and reduced independence in certain areas. Next slide. So this slide here shows us how risks and opportunities for prevention accumulate over time. Now, before major conditions develop, there are early signs like high blood pressure or kidney disease that start to appear, and that's a window to intervene. And at the same time, addressing things like housing conditions or alcohol harm, smoking and inactivity across that life course, that can delay or prevent later decline. And the key point here is that prevention is not just clinical, it's about the social, environmental and community-based assets too. Again, thinking about that word prevention, we often use this pyramid to explain where we can take action. At the bottom of the pyramid, you can see the term primordial prevention. That simply means shaping the conditions for health in the first place, things like housing, income, early childhood experiences. Next up, we have primary prevention, which is focused on reducing risk factors like smoking and poor diet. And then further up the pyramid, in the pink section, we have secondary prevention, which focuses on identifying early disease, things like high blood pressure or kidney disease. And then right at the top of this pyramid, we have tertiary prevention, which is about supporting people who already have a long-term condition to live well. And as people get older, it's the secondary and tertiary prevention that becomes increasingly important for helping to maintain independence, to delay decline, and to reduce treatment burden. Next slide, please, Chris. So thinking more broadly about those wider determinants I mentioned earlier, in the Westmoreland and Furness area, which is where I work, we're now adapting the World Health Organization's age-friendly communities approach. And this recognises ageing as a whole system issue, not something that's just for the NHS to address. It's a framework that has 8 domains, which includes housing, transport, outdoor spaces, social participation, employment, community support. And the framework links public health with planning, with housing, with transport and with social care, with a view to creating places where people can stay active, they can stay connected, and they can remain independent for longer. Now, this approach directly supports the Chief Medical Officer's call for environments that make independence possible at every age. And it's hopefully going to help us get away from the more siloed thinking that we've often seen, and it'll hopefully make ageing well everybody's business. And for my final slide, Chris. So this is what I often like to share with people. So the themes that we've touched on just briefly just now, they're not abstract. This is actually about real people. It's about real communities that we live in. And one important thing to remember is that thinking about aging well is going to look different for every community. So what works in Kendal, it's not going to work necessarily in Millham or in Appleby, Carlisle or Barrow or Whitehaven. The local geography, isolation, housing, transport and community assets, they all shape people's experience of aging. So real solutions, they need to be tailored to the local places, and they need to be grounded in the experiences of the people who live there. I'm going to hand back to you now to Chris, but before I do, I'd just like to summarise by saying that I genuinely and passionately believe that we really can help people to age well, but we really do need our environments and our communities and our services to work together so that we can support older people with their independence, with dignity and with that connection. Thank you for listening.
That's great. Thanks, Catherine. And in our final minute, just to bring us into land, first of all, just as a recap for any of you not familiar with parts of the system, obviously we have the two local government areas. So we have Westmoreland and Furness in the south and Cumberland in the north, with the two directors of public health, Katrina and Colin. Within the NHS, we're very fortunate to have public health consultants in myself working at UHMBT and Leslie Jones working in NCIC as being senior leaders in that space, alongside obviously primary care colleagues who are very active in this space. And as Catherine has just touched on, obviously the assets of local communities and the voluntary community, faith and social enterprise sector. And so finally, and I won't run through these now, but just to highlight the range of opportunities there currently are across public health and population health working in Cumbria to consider, from Barrow Rising and the strategic defence endeavour going on there, all the way through the National Neighbourhood Health Implementation Programme. Perhaps in the questions, Catherine can talk a little more about some of the targeted health checks and the work going on around ageing, but also obviously wider questions around how do we monitor outcomes for some of these sort of smaller and more isolated communities? What is the role of the NHS in responding to the wider determinants of health? And then finally, in my other hat, so being the module lead for prevention and healthcare delivery at PCSM, where our students spend deliberate time thinking about this space, we have a range of opportunities in teaching, including a number of exciting community research projects that they are just getting into starting now, and which will follow them through longitudinally to give them a chance as they train for their medical careers to experience what it is to work in an asset-based way at a local level. So thank you all for your attention and the chance to share that with you today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Catherine. I'd now like to introduce our third speaker of the day, Professor Sir Rory Collins, who's Emeritus Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology at the University of Oxford and Principal Investigator of the UK Biobank, one of the most successful interventions in research and public health, I think, that's ever been seen in the UK. So Rory, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on the webinar today. So again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about UK Biobank, which was founded by the Medical Research Council and the Wellcome Trust at around the beginning of the century, and we started actually recruiting participants, as I describe on the next slide, in 2006, and set up invitation centres all around Scotland, England, Wales, and recruited 500,000 people who at the time were aged 40 to 69. We tried to locate the recruitment in parts of the world, parts of the country, where we would get a diverse range of individuals. Next slide, please. Sorry, next, yeah. In terms of rural, urban, younger, older, different socioeconomic status, and also by locating in particular parts of the country a different ethnicity. And we ended up with a very diverse range of individuals, which allows researchers to look at the effects of environment, lifestyle, and genetics in people with very different exposure levels. We collected a lot of information from them about their lifestyle, environment, personal, family, medical history, did various physical measurements and assessments of cognition, hearing, and vision, and collected biological samples, which we then stored for subsequent assays. Next click, please. We have consent from all of them to access all of their medical and other health-related records, and also to contact them to get more information, although we do not provide feedback of any of their individual results. So they are, if you like, contributing to a research resource in the same way that a blood donor would contribute blood without any personal benefit other than whatever research findings come out and are implemented in practice. So they're really doing it for the public as a whole. The data are made available to all researchers around the world, both academic and commercial researchers, in order to make the most of the data there and make the most discoveries possible. And I'll come back to how successful that has been. Next, please. So when one thinks about what has been special with UK Biobank, there are 4 dimensions that I want to talk about. First of all, it's very large, 500,000 people. Next, please. Why does large matter? Well, we're recruiting people in middle age when they're generally healthy, and we're trying to understand why one individual gets a particular disease and another doesn't. Of course, within even 500,000 people, there will only be a relatively small proportion who develop any particular disease, and those will be the individuals that allow researchers to understand why they did, compared with those who didn't get that disease. So you need large numbers in order to have enough cases of a particular condition. But large is not enough. It also needs to be deep. By that, I mean you have to have very deep information about the exposures in those individuals and about the diseases they develop. Next, please. So the depth allows us to investigate, or researchers to investigate, all of the lifestyle, environment, and genetic determinants of disease in combination with the large scale. So the next slide describes the kind of depth of information we have. So at the baseline assessment, as I mentioned, we measured all of these things. But of course, when you ask people questions, if you ask them, for example, how active they are, or if you ask them about what they typically eat, they're not very reliable necessarily. So we went back to participants after they had joined the study, next please, and did 2 things. We sent out web questionnaires to them by email, and they could tell us, they would get a web questionnaire today, and then we would ask them, what did you eat yesterday? So they give us very specific information. We repeat that over time. We expanded on the information we had about occupation. So we got a questionnaire that asked them information about their full occupational history and used that to characterize exposures that they might have had during that occupation. When we ask people about how active they are, that they give us an answer, but what we also did was send out wrist-worn activity monitors that could monitor their activity over a week, and that gave information about their activity, their intensity of activity, amount of activity, type of activity, and also could monitor sleep. And we sent those again to a subset. Next, please. We recognized that we had really quite deep information from questionnaires. We've got these biological samples that we would be able to analyze, but we didn't have very much information about them physically, apart from height, weight, and blood pressure and heart rate. So we decided, in collaboration with imaging experts around the UK, to develop an imaging assessment of a very large subset. So 100,000 of the participants. We set up 4 imaging centres, one in Newcastle, one in Stockport near Manchester, one in Reading and one in Bristol, and invited participants to come to those imaging centres. Now, this was about a 5-hour visit. It involved, because there are only 4 centres, people travelling up to 100 miles, and yet these extraordinary participants agreed to come. So we got about a quarter of them were willing to come, and the next slide describes what they went through. They had a magnetic resonance imaging of the brain for 30 minutes, then magnetic resonance imaging of their heart and body down to their knees, as you can see in that picture. Low power X-ray to look at their bones, joints, body composition. Carotid ultrasound of their neck, which looks at the arteries in the neck to see if there's any furring up. Electrocardiogram. And then 30,000 of them, the older participants, went out with that device in the bottom right that you can see on their chest to monitor their cardiac rhythm, to look for atrial fibrillation and other abnormalities of cardiac rhythm. But because it was sitting on their chest and they wore it for 2 weeks, it also gives us more information about sleep and gait. So whether they have any irregular gait that might be related to neurological conditions. The imaging data on this scale are unprecedented. The biggest imaging studies in the past were a few thousand people. Typically, if somebody did a PhD, a doctoral research on cardiac imaging, they might image 20 people and analyze those all by hand. By creating this large imaging set, engineers have developed automated approaches to analyzing this imaging. Again, you can see the analysis of the imaging of the body there, looking at different distributions of the body. So these automated approaches allow researchers to take measurements that they can use in understanding why people have different body composition or brain composition, in the same way that you might analyze a blood sample. And in fact, now these automated approaches to analyzing the imaging from UK Biobank are being used within the NHS. Next, please. So that takes us so far, but then we wanted to turn the samples into data. The only analysis we did of the samples as they came in was to do hematological things, to look at anemia, to look at the red and white blood cells, because it has to be done on fresh blood. Once we completed the recruitment of everybody, we did some standard biochemical assays, things like cholesterol, blood glucose. But we then were provided with an opportunity to go further than that. Next slide, please. And initially, we got funding from the government to do what's called genotyping. So you have 3 billion base pairs across your genome, or if you like, little measures that you can make across the genome. And genotyping, we measured about 1 million of those, but because you inherit your DNA, your genome in chunks, measuring 1 million can actually give you information about the ones adjacent to the ones you measure. We then went on to measure the so-called exome, which is the part of the 3 billion base pairs, about 3% of the genome that actually makes the proteins. And then subsequently, with funding from the Medical Research Council, the Wellcome Trust, and industry, did so-called whole genome sequencing. So every single base pair across the genome of all 500,000 people were measured. Just to give a sense of that, the first person, the first human ever, was only genomed about 20 years ago. Here we are genoming 500,000 people and making those data available to the research community. And then we went on and are currently now doing analyses of the proteins in the blood, the metabolites in the blood, and that is currently ongoing. So you can see we're increasing enormously the characterization of the participants, and if you like, their exposures, the things that might lead to them developing disease. Next, please. But we haven't stopped there. We're now looking at so-called long-read sequencing. So this gives you information about how to put together the bits of the genome that are measured. So-called short-read sequencing, you can make sure that you put it in the right sequence. Epigenetic measures, which are ways in which the genome, the genetic material, is changed in subtle ways by exposures to the environment. It can give us information about how the genome will be read and turned into proteins. Next, please. We're looking at alternative ways of measuring proteins. You can get more information about that, and that is ongoing. Next, please. And we're considering other measures that we can do. Are there other aspects of metabolites that we can measure? Can we look at previous infection and previous response to the environment that might produce so-called autoimmune immune reactions that may be related to disease in later life? And we're considering in the next few years bringing everybody back in order to look at changes in their lifestyle and environment and changes in their biological samples to see how that relates to disease in the long term. Next, please. So that's the scale, the depth, and now we have the duration. Next, please. So one of the problems we have when we try to study the determinants of disease is that when we look at people quite soon after we've made measurements, the disease itself may affect those measurements. So we really have to look at disease that occurs many years after the measurements we've made. And on the next slide, you can see that we now have very large numbers of cases that have occurred in more than 15 years after we recruited the participants. So they start to be informative. We can avoid the disease having changed the risk factors that we've measured. We can be sure that we're looking at the effect of the risk factors on disease. Next, please. We're trying to now increase the depth of information, not only about the health exposures, but about the health outcomes, and in particular, trying to link to primary care data. So primary care is under the control of GPs. It's not available centrally. But on the next slide, you'll see that the Secretary of State understood this problem for studies like UK Biobank and Parallel Our Future Health study, and indicated that he was going to issue a direction to make those data available. He said that in October 2024. Next, please. And in February, so earlier this month, that direction was issued. Why does that matter? Well, it matters on the next click to be able to study conditions that are looked after by primary care. If all we can do is get information from the hospital or from mortality records, we miss a lot of the cases of conditions like depression, Alzheimer's disease, a form of dementia, asthma, chronic obstructive lung disease. So this is a major step forward, and it increases our ability to study diseases at an earlier stage before they get to hospital. Next, please. And we're now extending our information that we can get to get more deep information about the health outcomes that occur. Next, please. We're using these web questionnaires to find out about quality of life, about cognition and changes in cognition, mental health. Next, please. We're linking to specialized registries, so for cancers, to histopathology data and sequence data, such as Genomes England produce on tumors. We're bringing people back who have conditions like dementia or Parkinson's disease to get much more detailed assessment of them based on imaging. And as I mentioned, we want to bring everybody back not only to look at changes in their exposures, but to understand changes in the aging process and differences in the aging process in different people. Why do people age at different rates from each other? So can we look at healthy aging? Next, please. But there's no point in creating all these data if they're not made available to scientists to make sense of them, to understand why we do or don't develop a particular condition. So that's been the fourth and, in my view, most important dimension to UK Biobank. It was what the Wellcome Trust and the MRC asked us to do. Next, please. And it's this combination of scale and depth and duration and access that has made UK Biobank particularly special for the research community globally. Next. We have this data sitting on a cloud-based platform hosted by Amazon that keeps it secure and allows researchers to go to the data, which are now far too big to move around, and we can make available free compute for early career researchers and researchers in low and middle income countries through a donation from Amazon Web Services. And we see an increasing number of students and early career researchers using UK Biobank to help develop their careers. Next, please. So over time, we've seen it going from the UK into North America, into mainland Europe, Now, increasingly, we're seeing use in Asia, in China, Japan, Australasia. Thousands of institutions using the data to understand the causes and better ways to prevent and treat disease. Next, please. And this graph here shows the number of publications that researchers around the world have produced based on UK Biobank. So in 2025 alone, more than 5,000 publications in the scientific literature have been based on UK Biobank. Almost all the universities, top universities, use the data. Most of large companies who are trying to work out how to develop new treatments are using these data. And so finally, to just recognize the prescience of the Medical Research Council and Wellcome Trust in setting this up. Next, the contribution we now get from charity, Cancer Research UK, British Heart Foundation, and the NHS's National Institute of Health Research, but increasingly industry and indeed philanthropy from Schmidt Futures and Citadel and Amazon Web Services. Thank you very much.
Rory, thank you so much. What an extraordinary program Biobank has been, and that recent announcement over getting the primary care data is again going to be, yes, another bit of transformative work. So I'd like to thank our three speakers today, Professor Sir Rory Collins, Dr. Chris Chiswell, and Catherine Beckett, very much for their insightful presentations and the fascinating work. So thank you very much for attending. I thank the speakers most sincerely and look forward to seeing you in 4 weeks' time. Thank you.